You're always welcome." That was the sign that hung outside the motel that my family had owned for generations. A relic from the heyday of Route 66 nestled among large pines just off a 2-lane mountain road. My grandfather was a smart man and very opportunistic. When the cave system nearby was incorporated into the National Park Services, he capitalized on it. He built the motel, and shortly after our home right next to it. As tourism expanded, so did the motel, one room at a time. Eventually, our old living room was converted into the offices, and the door behind the lobby desk led directly into our kitchen. Eventually, our home and the motel were one and the same, and this is where I grew up. My grandfather passed down the business to my father when my sister and I were born. My father had also grown up in this isolated motel, so my mother always said he was hesitant to force the same fate on us. When my grandfather died suddenly, though, it was less of a choice and more of fate forcing itself on him. I have memories of my father talking about selling it, but that seemed to fade as we settled in as a family. Things seemed to go well for us, for a while at least. I remember this part of my childhood fondly. We lived in a place that seemed to be only described in fantasy books. My sister and I would play in the woods and wander down to the caves where we enjoyed free admission just for being cute kids ... and the only locals for miles around. These were the good times. Unfortunately, shortly after my older sister's 9th birthday, she began to get sick. The doctors in the city wanted to see her often, and it was not easy for my parents to get down the mountain in our old truck. She was diagnosed with a rare form of leukemia a week before her 10th birthday. I don't remember her death, but I remember the weeks leading up to it. When the doctors informed them that there was nothing more that could be done, my parents insisted on bringing her back up to us, to the motel. They set up some machines and other medical stuff in her room to help ease the pain. I was not there when she died. My parents, for whatever reason, had sent me to my aunt's. Looking back now, I understand why. When I returned, though, my sister was gone. My mother did not take her death well. My sister's room was cleared of any trace that she once lived there, and I was not allowed to say her name. Every day there seemed to be less and less evidence that she had ever even lived there. Eventually, my mother went so far as to remove any photo we had of her from the house. By the time I was a teenager, there truly was no trace left of her existence. I hate to admit it, but my memory of her face had even gone. But I remembered what she smelled like, soft lavender. I left the motel when I went to college and lived an exciting yet uneventful life far away from that small spot on the mountain. But as my parents grew older, they needed more help, and I felt myself drawn back into that old mountain motel. I helped them for a good part of 12 years, slowly taking on more and more of the responsibilities until I almost ran the place by myself. They still insisted on certain tasks, odd things that they were not ready to give up. The strangest involves what I have come to call the family. My memories of them stretch back to my earliest memories of the motel. They always stuck out because my parents seemed to treat them differently. For as long as I can remember, they had always visited us every 4 years, almost to the day. The family consisted of 4 adults, an older couple, a middle-aged couple, 2 teenagers, a girl and a boy, and a younger girl around the age of 11. The 7 of them were always quiet and polite, and always stayed for a week, every 4 years like clockwork. My parents had even circled the date on our calendars, always expecting them. My father made sure to have a room open, even though they never seemed to book ahead. They were almost like old friends, except for the fact that they treated us like strangers every single time. It wasn't like they didn't remember us, but more that we were inconsequential to their lives. The interactions we had with them were so brief and infrequent that if it weren't for one odd thing, I doubt I'd have remembered them. But it was that one odd thing that hung over my head, never explained, but never acknowledged by my parents. Eventually I came to accept it as well, as something as ordinary as apple pie, but it wasn't ordinary. There was nothing ordinary about the fact that this family never seemed to age. They came every 4 years and they never missed a visit. There were years, though, that I missed them, especially after my sister died. My parents would send me to live with my aunt for a bit, and it always seemed to coincide with their visit. There was over a decade where I went without seeing them until my aunt and mother had a falling out. I was never told what it was over, but I never saw my aunt again after that last visit. One time when I was back from college, they were there, same as always, just as I remembered. They'd spend their days in their room and would leave at night, always dressed like they were going someplace special. Every evening except for the last, I would clean the room after they left. The beds were always made and the room was very tidy except for the ashtrays. Whoever it was, the old man I expect, smoked like a chimney. Even after my parents stopped allowing smoking inside, they made an exception for the family. On the final day, though, my parents always insisted on cleaning the room. Despite their tidiness, it always took my parents hours to clean that room. One time they took nearly 2 days, but they still would not allow me to help. On the family's last visit, while my parents were alive, I had to help my father carry carpet into the room. We had spare rolls of carpet saved in case we ever had to fix a cigarette burn or a particularly nasty stain. We usually only needed a few inches or a foot at a time. The family's room, however, had the carpet replaced more times than I could count. On this last time, my father was tired and struggled with the work. I could tell my mother did not want me to help, but they had no choice. They had already pulled up the old carpet before I was allowed in, but I still noticed it. Deep brown stains in the wood beneath the carpet just outside the bathroom. My mother was still scrubbing when I carried in the replacement roll. "Is that blood?" I asked, pointing as the frothy pink foam beneath my mother's brush. She shot my father a look of anger. "They are hunters," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. The dark stained ring that always seemed to exist in the bathtub of this room suddenly started to make sense. "This is a lot of blood," I said, hoping for more answers. "It was probably a big animal," my father replied, annoyed. It made no sense to slaughter an animal in a motel bathroom, but I realized that I wouldn't be getting any more answers from my father. I let it be. I figured I'd ask again in 4 years. I didn't get a chance, though, as both of my parents passed within months of each other. I'd like to say they died peacefully at home, same as my sister, but they did not. My father had a heart attack, and while he was in the hospital, my mother had a stroke. My father died shortly after, but my mother seemed to hold on for longer than anybody thought possible. She was waiting for something, but she never revealed what it was. She died in her sleep with an immense look of sadness on her face. As was expected, they left the motel to me. The lawyer explained that the will was very brief and uncomplicated. My parents had no money saved and the motel was their only asset, so I was given everything. They did leave me something else, though, in addition to the burden of a family business. They left 3 envelopes with very specific instructions on when to open them. The first one was to be opened when I took over ownership of the motel. The second was to be opened in case of an emergency, namely a financial one. The third was to be opened by my aunt in case I passed away. The letter within the first envelope was brief and to the point. It explained that my parents had a long-standing agreement with the family, and it was best not to question it. They mentioned the blood, but told me to ignore it and just make sure there was no trace left after they checked out. It was very explicit that I not ask questions, and that if anybody outside of them were to ask about the family, I was to deny everything. And something I found funny, and not surprising, the family's odd trait of seemingly never aging was not mentioned in the letter. After reading it twice, I stored the letter in the cash drawer and forgot about it. Shortly after my mother passed, the family arrived. The 7 of them piled out of that same old station wagon and walked together to my office. Without my parents insisting on doing it themselves, this was the first time I had actually checked the family in. The old man greeted me as if he knew me. He did not ask about my parents, and in an odd way he spoke to me as if I had always been the one to check them in. All but the little girl seemed to watch me without expression. The little girl, however, broke away from the group and stepped around the desk and knocked on the door leading to our kitchen. None of the family reacted in any way to her actions. "Can I help you?" I asked her. "Is she in there?" she asked, almost emotionless. "It's just me now. My parents passed a few months back," I explained as I grabbed the room key. The older man took the key without acknowledgement of the fact that my parents were dead, but the little girl broke down. She began to sob and yell for her mother, but instead one of the teenagers took her by the arm and pulled her along as they left together. Her sad eyes met mine, and for a moment I felt an unspoken grief between us over my parents' absence. I had made the decision to close the motel long before my sister left that photograph. The plans were in motion, and it seemed as if nothing was going to stop the sale. That is until he arrived. I hadn't bothered to clean their room after the family had left, too emotionally drained to take on the horrifying task. Instead, I retreated back into the house to surround myself with memories and make a meal that my mother used to make for my sister, spaghetti and meatballs with garlic toast. It was comforting. I was cleaning up after dinner when I heard the front door open to the office. The old service bell at the front desk rang loud enough for me to hear. The vacancy sign had long been extinguished and the front door to the office had been locked after the family left. Whoever had rung the bell, they were not welcomed in. I opened the door slowly, with the kitchen knife gripped tightly in my hand. "We're closed," I warned them. The door swung open to an empty room. "I am late," said a voice from the darkest corner of the room. He looked like an animal cowering in the corner, balled up and small. He was more of an unkempt shape than a person, covered in mud and grime. When he stood up, I saw how bad he looked. The dirt reached every crevice as if he were buried in it, and only the whites of his eyes stood out from the black coat of mud. He was thin, almost emaciated, but still had a strength about him. "I'm sorry, but we're closed," I repeated. "But the sign," he said, pointing up at the "You're always welcome" sign hanging just outside the window. We don't have any clean rooms." "I'm sorry, you'll have to find somewhere else," I said, feeling a sudden sense of discomfort. His white eyes met mine with a stare so intense, it felt as if he were looking straight through me. "But we already have a room," he said. His voice was soft yet commanding and wholly devoid of emotion. It was then that I recognized him. He was the teenage boy from the family, thought thinner than I remembered. His familiar young features were caked in filth, but I knew it was him. He knew that I knew. "Have they departed?" he asked. I nodded. "Have they left me anything?" he asked, his voice finally cracking. I did not know how to answer. I wasn't sure what he meant. "Have they left any behind?" he said, sounding suddenly desperate. "I don't know," I said, pulling the room keys from their hook. "But you are welcome to check." He took the keys from my hands, his eyes lingering on my arm. It was as if he saw something I did not. "Thank you," he said, and left the office, trailing mud out the door. It wasn't until he was gone that I realized the trail of mud only led outside. That night, I could not sleep. I watched his room from my window and waited for him to leave, but once he closed that door, it seemed as though he disappeared inside. He never even turned on the light. I only left my perch long enough to make coffee, but even then I listened for the creak of that heavy old door. I never did hear it. When day came, I decided to check on him. I knocked many times and announced my intent to enter. He did not respond. The door opened with that familiar old creak and sun once again crept into that dark room. Cigarette smoke still hung heavy in the air and danced in the beams of light. The room key sat idle next to the ashtray. "Hello," I said. "Maya." The room itself appeared empty, but I traced his muddy tracks from the door to the table, then to the bathroom. He had smoked the old butts left by the others and left nothing behind but burnt filters. The beds, again, were untouched. I knocked gently on the bathroom door. "Are you okay?" I asked. The carpet sloshed under feet, wet from the bathroom overflow. "I'm coming in," I announced, already turning the knob. As the bathroom door turned inward, it pushed aside a layer of sticky, wet sludge. It was a mixture of deep red and earthen brown. The putrid sweet smell of decay hit before my eyes could comprehend the horror of what lay before me. The bathtub was half filled with thick old blood and clumps of mud left behind by the boy. His clothes were piled in a damp, muddy heap just outside the bath. The floor was sticky with blood and dirt. But still, I stepped inside. The bathtub was full enough with that gruesome sludge that something could still be hiding beneath the surface. As I had done many times before, I reached in and pulled the plug. My hand brushed against something inside and I recoiled. The bubbling gurgle of rotting body fluids oozed down the drain as I waited to see what was hidden inside. Thankfully, it was not the boy. It was the severed leg of a deer that had brushed my hand. The hoof was gnarled, cracked, and the leg itself was nothing more than coarse flesh suspended by tendons still clinging to bone. The muck left behind in the emptied bath was a slurry of torn organ meat, and UN rendered fat, the remnants of a slaughtered beast. In all my years cleaning, they had never left this kind of evidence. It was always blood, massive amounts of blood and bile, but never anything that couldn't be drained. I assumed then that this was left by the boy. I did my best to shovel the decaying bits of carcass into a plastic bag, and then used old sheets and towels to sop up the puddles of putrid death that remained. I threw all of it into the burn pit out back. I emptied an entire bucket of bleach into the bathroom, just to hide the smell. Exhausted, I fell asleep on the bed, steeped the odors of death and cigarette smoke. I dreamt of my sister. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I could see her face again. When I awoke, it was still the afternoon, but the boy had not returned. I was hungry and covered in filth. I showered in the hottest water I could stand, hoping to burn the odor from my skin. Afterwards, I made a sandwich and returned to my perch at the window. I had left the door open to air out the room. I figured that if he had returned, he would close it, but it was open. Night came and I wondered if he had just gone on ahead, searching for the family. I decided that I should close the door and lock it. I had taken his key with me after I had cleaned, so if he wanted back in, he'd have to ask. The moment my foot stepped past the threshold of the room, I saw his white eyes shrouded in the shadows across the room. He was standing just outside the open bathroom. He stood there, motionless and nude but covered in something else. It wasn't the dirt like before, but a deep red crust that cracked dry on his skin. "It is not enough. It has rotted," he said from the shadows. "What are you?" I blurted out. He waited an eternity to answer, just staring at me from across the room. "You know," he said in a weak, hushed voice. "I don't. Is my sister." "Is she like you?" I asked. He nodded in a way that seemed he was confused that I was even asking. I stepped backwards out of the room. He stepped forward into the faint moonlight shining across the floor. His body was covered in dry blood and his hair was matted in a thick black tangle. "Please don't hurt me," I stuttered. His eyes grew wide as he approached, before he stopped suddenly. His ghoulish features were suddenly awash in amber headlights. He recoiled and retreated back into the shadows of the room. I turned to see the blinding beams of an old pickup truck as it pulled into our parking lot. I glanced back at the boy, but he was gone. The door to the truck opened and a tall, sinewy man with close-cropped hair and thick-rimmed glasses stepped out. He was an older gentleman, gray around the temples, but not elderly by any means. His stature was intimidating and his voice was deep. "Hello," he said, still hidden behind the bright lights of the truck. "Can I help you?" I asked, shielding my eyes. "Sorry," he apologized, then leaned back into the cab and turned off the lights. I felt myself trapped between the monster behind me and the stranger approaching from the front. Without realizing, I had backed myself against the wall. "You work here?" he asked, noting my retreat and stepping back himself. "No vacancies," I shouted, slightly louder than needed. He looked around the lot and squinted at the darkened motel sign. "Right," he said. We're closed now." "I'm sorry," I said, slightly softer. "I like to stay the night if that is possible. It's been a bit of a drive and we both know there aren't any options anywhere close." "We don't have any rooms available," I said, clearing my throat. "What about that one?" he asked, pointing behind me to the open door. "It isn't clean," I explained. "I don't mind," he said, closing the door to his truck. "I can pay in cash if you fancy it." I shook my head. He leaned one hand on the truck. "None of the rooms are furnished," this one was, "but an animal got in and died. I was cleaning it. It wouldn't be sanitary." He stepped forward into the lights of the motel. His face was hard and serious, and altogether unsettling. I couldn't help but think back to that writer, about what he said. This man could be one of them, I thought. Here I was with my back to a danger I could not comprehend, while in front of me stood a potential serial killer. He must have read the discomfort on my face. "Okay then. Do you mind if park here for the night? Sleep in my truck?" he asked, trying to sound disarming. I thought about it long and hard. "I don't see why not," I said, against my better judgment. He smiled and opened the door to his truck. "Appreciate it," he said, disappointed. I turned back towards the room, but even with the light from the truck I could not see inside. I closed the door and locked it. After that, I locked every door I walked through until I was in my own bedroom. Still uneasy about the two threats that were sleeping only a few hundred feet away, I decided to arm myself. I don't like guns, I've never owned one, and I don't care to ever buy one. But my father taught me how to shoot. In fact, he taught me to shoot with my grandfather's old revolver, the same one that was locked in a box beneath my bed. It was my father's lockbox, and aside from the gun, I had no idea what I'd find. I had to use a hammer and old screwdriver to break the lock, and after only a few attempts I was able to pop it open. As expected, the gun sat atop a pile of important documents, photos and small mementos that meant something to my father at some point in his life. 6 loose bullets rattled around the steel box. They appeared to be handmade, not purchased, and somehow older than myself. Each one tipped in shiny polished silver. I loaded the revolver and sat it aside. The photos hidden beneath it were not ones I had recognized from my childhood. These were all, for some reason, private to him. The top photograph was of my parents, years before I was born. My aunt that I hadn't seen in years stood next to my mother, smiling and holding the hand of a man in his early 30s. The man looked eerily familiar. He reminded me, maybe too much, of the middle-aged man in the family, though the man in the photo looked too happy to be the expressionless shell I'd known my whole life. The photo beneath that one was of my grandfather standing stone-faced in front of the earliest version of the motel. Beside him were 4 others, who were without a doubt 4 members of the family. None of them, my grandfather included, were smiling. To the right of my grandfather stood the older 2 members of the family, then the middle-aged woman and the teenage girl. The boy and the middle-aged man were missing. The photo was old and faded, but even then it was clear they looked the same as they did only a few days ago. Beneath that I found my sister's birth certificate, old bonds, the deed to the motel, and other uninteresting documents of worth. Below everything, though, was one more thing. A stiff card wrapped in the same paper the family's money was wrapped in, tied with the same twine. I opened it. I unwrapped it to reveal the backside of a photograph, newer than the others, with Chicago, 1974, written in a handwriting that was foreign to me. It was not my mother's or father's. I flipped the photo and felt a cold chill run down my spine. I saw myself younger than I had ever seen in any family photo. I was dressed in a corduroy overalls and standing in front of an old building. The oddest thing, though, was that I was standing between 2 vaguely familiar adults, holding their hands. All 3 of us were smiling. I wish I could say I was able to place their faces, but I could not. I had to assume they were family friends, but to my knowledge, my parents never had many friends, and those that did would be the ones to visit us. My entire life, my parents made the motel the priority. We had never taken a family trip together outside of a holiday weekend at my aunt's. In fact, as far as I could recall, neither of them had ever mentioned visiting Chicago, and they definitely never said anything about seeing friends there. Who were these people? Where were my parents? Why wasn't my sister with me? My breath grew more rapid with each thought, and I slammed the box shut. I already had too many questions that seemed to be impossible to answer. I was not ready for more. Thankfully, the exhaustion overwhelmed my mind, and I eventually drifted off to sleep. The loaded gun sat safely on the nightstand next to me. I had even pushed a chair beneath the knob of my bedroom door. With the heavy curtains pulled closed, the sun never crept in, and I awoke very late in the morning. Even before coffee, I made my way out to the parking lot. The truck, however, was already gone. I started to feel a tinge of guilt for judging the strange man as I did. That guilt, though, would only deepen as the day progressed. I opened the door to the boys' room. The morning sun flooded in, immediately casting away any dark corners. Immediately, the smell of iron strung my nose. As I stepped up to the bathroom door, my feet once again squished into the soaking wet carpet. The door was unlocked, but as I opened it, I heard the familiar slosh of coagulated blood being pushed aside. I stepped into a familiar, but no less unsettling sight of a tiled white bathroom coated in a crimson blood. I prayed to myself that it was again that of an animal, though even that did not sit well with my conscience. Just to be safe, I decided to clean. I needed to be sure that no trace of the teenage boy was left behind, just in case somebody else came through unexpected. That strange man now made me nervous in an entirely different way. I was so focused that I forgot to make myself coffee. Instead, I went straight to work sopping up the massive amounts of blood. It was only when I was on the floor scrubbing that I noticed some of the blood seep through seams in the tiled floor, narrow cracks and 3 straight lines forming a box against the wall. I then noticed that the baseboard beneath the sink had been removed, and there were small finger-sized holes in the floor where it met the wall. I crawled across the floor, still slick with blood, and slipped my fingers in. I was able to get underneath and pull up what turned out to be a door or hatch in the floor. As I pulled it open, blood seeped down into the crawl space beneath the bathroom. A crawl space that until now I had no idea even existed. I had no choice but to investigate. It was not large, but deep enough to walk through without crawling. It spread maybe 10 feet in every direction. It was dark, but my phone's flashlight was bright enough to reveal even the furthest corner. Thankfully, the boy was nowhere to be seen. The floor beneath me was soft dirt made muddy from the blood that seeped down. The walls appeared to be crafted from old red brick and mortared in place, unlike any other foundation on the property. Words written in an unfamiliar language were carved into the walls. It smelled of smoke, stale breath, and iron. I moved further in to explore the hidden room. Strange crystalline rocks were scattered half-buried around the floor, much like the ones you'd find in the now-closed caverns. The most unsettling aspect, though, was the heaps of soft dirt that were arranged in 7 large piles throughout the room, one for each member of the family. Immediately, the room itself felt heavy with dread. I got out as quickly as possible. I left the crawl space as I had found it and replaced the baseboard, just in case. I finished cleaning the bathroom and doused everything in bleach, careful to avoid the cracks in the floor. When I returned to the office, there was a message flashing in red on the office phone. I checked, and it was from my lawyer, so I returned the call. He informed me that the buyer from the property was expected to stop by. I was told he wanted to see it firsthand, but he was an odd fellow and may not announce his intentions. I could only assume it was the man from last night. He then changed the subject, and with a somber tone in his voice, he asked if I had heard from anyone in my family. No, I told him. Aside from my aunt, I had no family left. Well then, I hate to be the one to tell you this, but she passed a few weeks ago, he said, clearly uncomfortable. What? What happened? I asked, expecting anything at this point. Well, from what I understand, there was a fire at her property and everything she possessed had perished in it, along with her. Her estate had a little trouble getting in touch with me, he said, stammering over the last part. So the business is gone, I asked, because she, like my parents, owned a small hospitality business. While it wasn't a motel, it was what you would consider a bed and breakfast. Honestly, it was less of a business and more of a hobby for her. Everything he confirmed. A small part of me was relieved that I wouldn't be burned with that place as well. There was a moment of awkward silence, and I could hear him shuffling through papers on his end of the line. Is there anything I need to do, or are you going to take care of transfers or estate or whatever? I mean, other than the property, I don't know what I'd want of hers. Hell, even the property I'm not sure I want to deal with. This place is enough. I chuckled in an awkward moment of levity. He didn't laugh. Instead, I just heard more shuffling. That is the strange thing. She left you nothing, he said, rather bluntly. That's fine with me. I'd rather not deal with it. Well, he said, you still may have to. You see, she left everything to your sister. How old was her, I asked. She updated it after your parents passed. Oh. But I guess now would be the time to open the envelope they left for her. Might have some answers. Oh, okay. I'll do that, I said, already worrying about dealing with it all. The conversation shifted onto other aspects of the sale and what I would need to do to prepare for it. All the while, the man from last night was in the back of my mind. In an unexpected turn of events, I was hoping he would return. After the call, I tried to push it all out of my mind. The boy was gone, and as far as I knew, the man had left in the morning as well. I was alone again, high in the mountains in this isolated, lonely motel. I wasn't hungry, but I fixed myself a drink and decided to take my lawyer's advice. I retrieved the third letter left by my parents from the cabinet where it had stayed since the day he dropped it off. Carefully, I tore open one end. Even folded, I could see through the thin parchment that the message was brief, but it was undeniably written in my mother's handwriting. It said, "I fear they are no longer the ones we loved. Burn it down, burn it all down, burn it all down." Those words rung clear in my heard as if my mother were whispering them in my ear. Trust me, I wanted nothing more than to be done with this, the motel and the family. But there were some things I just couldn't let go. I started to worry that if I sold the motel, other secrets would be revealed. Dark secrets, damaging secrets. I could fill in that pit below their room, but what else was hiding on the motel grounds? I had no choice but wait for the sale to either go through or fail. In the meantime, I packed up what I could from our old family home. Every photograph of my parents now felt different, less genuine. Why would they keep so much from me? I asked out loud to a room of family artifacts and meaningless mementos. Nobody answered me. 2 days passed and I waited for either the boy or the man in the truck to return. Instead, the first car to pull into my parking lot was that of the local sheriff. My body tensed and my mind went to the room and the blood-soaked carpet that I never replaced. I questioned whether or not I'd actually be honest if he asked about it. Yes, of course I would be. I had nothing to hide. I knew nothing, except for the fact that I'd rented rooms to soulless, immortal creatures that somehow acquired gallons upon gallons of blood without notice. I began to doubt my own composure. I waited at the open door to the office while he sat in the cruiser for 10 minutes or so. I wasn't sure if he saw me or not, but regardless, I held my ground. I noticed a little too late, my cleaning supplies abandoned in the lobby next to gallons of bleach. The cruiser door slammed shut and snapped my attention back to him. As he approached, he scanned the surroundings, taking note of the unlit vacancy sign. He turned back and registered the curtain-less windows of each emptied room. That is, of course, except for the families. "Afternoon," he said with a tip of his hat. "What can I do for you?" I asked, as friendly as possible. He removed his shades and peeked over my shoulder into the lobby. "Wondering if I could have a moment of your time to ask some questions," he said with a smile. "Regarding?" Well, he turned back to the mostly emptied rooms. "You have any guests recently?" he asked. "Closed down a few weeks back, unfortunately," I said, trying to hide my anxiety. "That's not what I asked," he said, smiling again, but this time with menace. "Sorry," I apologized. "I don't mean to be rude or nothing, but we know Bill Henley was on his way up here a few days back. Just wondering if he made it." "Sorry, don't know him," I said, hoping to end the conversation there. "You don't know the man who was fixing on buying your place?" he asked, again looking back at the family's room. "Oh, him." "Yeah, him," he said, prying for more. My lawyer handled it all. I didn't meet him," I lied. "Not even when he stopped here for the night," he asked, showing his cards. I swallowed hard. I wanted to tell the truth, but I wasn't ready for what came with it. "Oh, did he drive a truck?" I asked. "He did." "Then yes, I saw it. Parked it over there," I said, foolishly pointing towards the room. The sheriff turned to the room, to the parking spot, to my secrets. He took out a notepad and began to write something down. But he didn't stay with us. We were closed, so he slept in his car. I think I stuttered. "Think," he asked, looking back to me. I didn't see him leave. But yeah, he was here for a bit. If you know, the truck belonged to him and all, I said, fumbling over my words. "It did," he said, putting the notebook away. "Mind if I take a look around?" "Of course not," I said, the words tumbling out of my mouth before my mind could stop them. I stepped aside to sort of lead him into the lobby, away from the family's room. Immediately, he took notice of the cleaning supplies and the bleach. "Is there a problem? Is he okay?" I asked, regretting my words immediately. The sheriff's gaze lingered on the bleach for a very long time. He then turned his attention back to me. I could see his mind working over something. thinking. Suddenly it felt as if the air in the room shifted. His entire demeanor changed and I felt an aura of warmth from him. He shrugged and cracked a smile. Well, I figured it's going to be on the news soon anyway. If it ain't already. What I asked. Well, nothing good, that's for sure. That truck you saw, they found it about 200 or so miles west of here, off the 80. All the way out there? What was he doing, I asked, feigning surprise. Well, we don't know. We don't know where he is, he said, his gaze drifting now to the knickknacks and photographs. Oh, that's not good. I don't like that, I said, truthfully. You really ain't gonna like the next part. That buyer of yours has a lot to answer for. Like what I asked, cutting him off. Well, the body they found in the cab, burnt to a crisp. Abandoned, he said, picking up a photograph of myself and my parents. I thought you said he was missing. You sure it wasn't him, I asked, trying to find something to do with my fidgeting hands. Too young, too small to be him. Best we can recon, it's a young man they found. No ID, though. John Doe, he said, looking hard at the photo. These your parents? I nodded. He looked back at the photo, then back at me. Biological, he asked. I'm told I look more like my grandparents, really, I said. He smiled and returned the photo. I believe he then looked for photos of my grandparents, but there were none. We stood there trapped in a long, awkward silence. I motioned towards the kitchen door behind the front desk. Did you still want to look around, I asked, trying to lead him. No, maybe later. Just needed to confirm he was here, really, he said, making his way back outside. I followed. Okay, well, thank you for stopping by, I said, foolishly. He paused at the door, acknowledging my awkward statement. Then I saw it again, his mind working. He put his sunglasses back on. He was alone here, you said, he asked. I thought hard. What did I tell him? Did I slip? I couldn't remember. I don't know, I said. He looked at me as if he could tell I was lying. Could have been someone else in the truck. It was dark. Can't say for sure, I stammered out. He nodded in acceptance. Thank you for your time, he said. And with that, he was gone. But as he drove by the only remaining curtains still hanging in the motel rooms, he made a point to slow and look as he passed. I waited until he was out of sight and then ran back home as fast as I could. As soon as I reached the bathroom, I vomited. My nerves were a tangle of anxiety and guilt. I knew that the body they found had to belong to the teenage boy. But what about the man? He was either still alive or still here. I searched the motel grounds for any sign of the man or other secret spots. I wandered past the property line into the clearing, and with the sunlight beating down on me, I had an epiphany. The teenage boy was on his way to another place like ours, a sanctuary. He would never have let himself get caught outside like that, not on purpose. In all my years of knowing the family, I had never seen them at any time close to dawn or dusk. They were experts at avoiding the sun. Wherever he was going, he couldn't have been far from his destination. I knew what I had to do. I had to find their next stop. I had to know if it was anything like the motel. And if it was, how? Why? Could there be more of those earthen rooms cluttered with crystals and soft dirt, covered in strangely written runes? I had to know. I packed what I could into my small car and locked up the motel. Before I left, I made sure to reload my grandfather's gun and place it in my bag, which I then placed on the passenger seat. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I was fairly certain that if I found anything, I had to be ready. The drive was long, but I drove slowly. I kept an eye out for any building or structure that could hide them. Luckily, the highway was an extension of the one that the motel sat on. It was another dead road. A long stretch of nothing, so spotting anything would be easy. As I passed the 200-mile marker, I slowed to a crawl and leaned over my steering wheel. An old barn crept into view around the 220 mark, and I knew it had to be there. It was the only building within miles. I pulled into the old dirt road alongside deep tire tracks left when the rain softened it into mud. I stepped out of the car and pocketed the revolver. The sky overhead was gray and made for a dark afternoon. I followed the tracks as they led into the old rotted barn. The heavy doors were in disrepair, but the hinges swung as if they were new. Inside the barn was what you would expect from an antique structure. Old brittle hay and rusted equipment were left and forgotten. Everything looked as if it hadn't been touched in decades. Everything except for a strange metal watering trough in the center of the barn. The sickening realization of what it was had set in before I even saw the familiar dark rings around the inside. Like the bath in their room, this had been filled with blood. The ground surrounding the trough was stained from decades of crimson ichor seeping into it. As I stepped close, the ground bowed beneath my feet and the wood groaned. I stomped. The hollow echo of an empty chamber could be heard below. I kicked aside the dust and hay to reveal the trapdoor. There was less effort put into hiding this one, but then again the location itself was a hiding spot. I found the finger holes and pulled up the door. That familiar scent of smoke, stale breath, and iron wafted up. I pulled the revolver from my pocket and climbed down. The room was smaller than the one below the motel, but it was very much the same. Odd words were again carved into the walls, but wood replaced brick in this more ramshackle construction. The strange crystalline rocks were placed around the room in a pattern I hadn't noticed beneath the motel. There were fewer here, but enough to catch my eye. I pulled one out of the dirt and held it in my hand. Soft dusted salt seemed to rub off with the slightest touch. It was heavy in my hand, more than you would expect. I held it into the light from my phone. There were dark red and blue mineral veins streaking through the otherwise milky white crystal. It was so dry it felt as if it sucked the moisture from my fingertips. I pocketed it and continued on into the darkness. My foot sunk into an exceptionally soft patch of dirt. I realized I was standing on one of the earthen mounds, same as the 7 in the motel chamber. One, however, was unlike the rest. The dirt was discolored and more dry than the other mounds. There was also a fleck of white protruding just beneath the gray, unfertile soil. Hunched over, I made my way to the dying mound and uncovered a note written on a white piece of paper. A white piece of paper that just so happened to be stationery from our motel. It read, "Father, if you have found your way here, I am sorry. We waited for 3 days, but the fire burned so hot, Master said you could not return. I begged her to wait, but the soil grew damp and we had to move on. If you've made it here, you know about the orphan. Our oldest home is in danger. In my slumber I still feel your presence, so I have hope you will find us soon. Hopefully so, as we have left you a meal in the old farmhouse far from the road. I hope that it gives you the strength to find us again. Matthew." I left the note where it laid. The farmhouse in question was far from the barn, but I worried that driving up might bring unwanted attention. I walked through waist-high grass on the untilled soil of dead farmland. This plot of land had been long forgotten. The house itself was in better condition than the farm, but not by much. It had been lived in recently, but how recent I couldn't be sure. It was far from the highway and isolated in a way only rural homes can be. I approached from the side of the home and peered through the dust-covered windows. The decor had a timeless UN-tethered look, and it was unclear if it had been abandoned for years, or if the residents just had peculiar taste. Regardless, I saw no signs of movement inside. I thought about entering through the window, but caught myself and did the rational thing. I knocked on the front door. I thought I heard a brief flurry of restrained movement somewhere inside the house. My hand went immediately to the revolver. My voice was knotted and stuck in my throat. I swallowed hard and tried to call out, but my nerves wouldn't allow it. Instead, I reached out for the doorknob, and the moment my fingers made contact, the door drifted open. It felt as if I were being invited inside. My shoes slipped slightly on an old pile of mail stacked up from years of neglect. Some were postmarked from as far back as the late 90s. My first instinct about the decor was correct. Thick layers of dust seemed to coat most things in the home, but certain spots had been wiped clean with use. A path in the hallway rug was worn down from recent footsteps. I followed them to the kitchen. There were dishes in the sink and a box of discontinued cereal on the counter next to an empty jug of milk. The power had long ago been shut off, and the contents of the fridge had rotted past the state of decay and no longer even smelled. The ashtray on the kitchen table, however, was packed full of fresh butts. A single UN-smoked cigarette was left next to a matchbook. One thing became obvious: the meal was not left in the kitchen. "Hello," I called out, adjusting my grip on the revolver. A metallic rattle and a pained moan came from somewhere in another room. I stepped carefully in the direction of the ghostly noise. I could hear a subtle rhythmic tapping coming from behind the door of a room at the end of the hallway. The distance to that door felt longer than the distance from the house to the barn. The long, drawn-out moan seemed to seep out from beneath the cracks in the door. I removed the gun from my jacket pocket, and with my other hand I carefully opened the door. The ghoulish noise ceased in the moments that the door opened, replaced by the squeak of unused hinges. I stepped back and aimed. But it was just a bathroom. The soft blue and Pepto-pink tiles were not the horror I expected on the other side of the door. The pipes beneath the sink let out another ghostly moan as they groaned from unuse, and the steady drip of a leaky faucet pattered behind the shower curtain. I understand now that it was not the brightest idea, but I had driven for hours and I had no other options, none that would provide the comfort of a seat. So I placed the gun on the sink and sat down. I only had a moment of relief before I saw the silhouette behind the semi-opaque shower curtain. I pushed on the curtain thinking it was just a trick of the light, but my hand made contact with something solid. Before I could stand, the silhouette formed into the figure of a person as it reached out towards me. I stood quickly, but a withered white hand covered in blood emerged from the shower. I tripped and grasped for anything to catch myself. I grabbed hold of the only thing standing between myself and the figure, the shower curtain. As I fell back, the curtain tore from the rings and fell onto me. Frantically, I crawled backwards out from under the curtain and out of the room away from the gun. I pulled my pants up and struggled to my feet, realizing that the thing standing in front of me was not pursuing me. Instead, the emaciated figure of a dead man hung suspended above the bathtub, swaying slightly from my push. The room began to spin as the horror of what was in front of me became clearer with the sound of every wet drop of blood dripping into the bath. He was the meal. I grabbed the gun and before I knew it, I was already outside. I considered my options. I thought about burning it down, but that would only bring attention. I knew nothing about fingerprints and fire and evidence. The safest option was to do nothing. This house had remained hidden for so long. Why wouldn't it stay that way? Just to be safe, though, I took the shower curtain and wiped down any surface I remembered touching. I locked the door from the inside and closed it. The walk back to the barn was long and arduous. I replayed the images in my mind over and over and thought back to the bathtub I had cleaned so many times before. If there were any doubt in my mind before, it had been erased. The family that I had known my whole life were no longer human. They truly were creatures of the night that preyed on the weak and drank their blood. It should have been obvious, and maybe it was. Maybe my parents knew all along. They had to. But me, it had only coalesced in my mind after seeing the body. It became clear as day. Every 4 years, for a week at a time, I had been in the presence of an unearthly evil. They were inhuman, unnatural, and otherworldly. They were vampires. We were just one stop on their tour of death. They must have other places like ours, just close enough to make it in a night's drive. My aunt lived only a few hours east of us. My memories of visiting her came flooding back. It now made sense that every time I stepped into the guest house behind her home, the cellar door would smell of smoke, stale breath, iron, and every once in a while soft lavender too. It seems now that my aunt did what my parents couldn't. That is probably why they left her that last letter. They knew that she would be capable of doing what they never could. They had made the deal and tolerated slaughter under their roof, but part of me understood why. Even if they wanted to burn it all down, she was still their little girl and she needed a safe place. As I stood in front of the burned pit out back behind the motel, I watched the plastic shower curtain curl and melt in the flames. A flicker of light off glass caught my eye, just outside the center of the fire. I used a stick to dig it out. Glasses. Thick-rimmed glasses. He was never coming back. Bill Henley, the man who was going to purchase my motel, was not coming back. Like it or not, this motel was still mine. And as far as I knew, I still had 4 years to figure out what to do with it. Over the next few days, I was little more than a ghost haunting the motel grounds. I drifted from room to room trying to cobble together a purpose. I had quickly realized that I was bound to this property, and whether it was an ancient family curse or a legal contract, I was supposed to stay here and maintain the property. I felt obligated to protect my sister, even if she barely resembled the little girl I remembered. My mother, for all her faults, had done what she could to protect her daughter. Working over the events in my mind and recounting the visits of the family, I had come to the conclusion that my parents had made a deal to save my sister. I remember her illness, I remember her withering away before my eyes. She was going to die, it was a fact, but somehow she didn't. She continued living as an eternal child, cursed to walk an ever-evolving earth, as she herself was frozen in prepubescence. They had changed her, and I was determined to figure out how. I looked for clues in my father's old lockbox, but found little more than unfamiliar photos and documents that no longer had any relevance. One thing that stood out, though, was an early memento that my grandfather had kept. It was the first brochure for the cave system. If not for the scribbled red circle on the map, it may have been worth something. I spent an entire day sifting through the dirt in the space below their room. The soft earth that filled their mounds was starting to change. With the exception of what I assume was the teenage boys, the dark earthen mounds were starting to dry and crumble. The boys' spot was still dark with a fresh dampness about it, though it grew more dry and brittle with every passing day. The salty crystalline rocks placed near each mound seemed to draw out whatever moisture was in the dirt, drying it into a dead, useless dust. The crystals themselves were not unique, nor rare by any means. They were the same ones that lined the ceiling and floors in the deepest chambers of the caverns. I remembered them from my childhood visits. I felt a strange longing to return there. I needed to uncover its secrets. While they had been closed for almost a year now, there was still a park ranger named Graham, who remained on the premises. He would sometimes stop by for some of our free lobby coffee, always overpaying. He joked that we were the only coffee shop in town, which was partially true. I hadn't seen him in a few months, but his truck would pass regularly as he would survey the outlying grounds. I could tell he was bored, and I thought that I could manipulate that into an eagerness to help me. I called ahead, but the line went straight through to an automated recording, an apology to potential visitors about the indefinite closure. With little else to do, I made some coffee and filled a thermos for him. I drove down to the closed lot and parked just outside the locked fence. I could see his truck parked inside, so I knew he was there. He saw me arriving on the security camera, so he was already greeting me with a wave as I crossed the closed parking lot. "Afternoon, Graham," I shouted on approach. "What brings you down here?" "Research," I said, asking myself the same question. "When was the last time you made here?" "Years. My folks were still around." "Ah, well, there's a lot to see." The remodel finished right before the shutdown. "I've been dying to show somebody around, so I'm glad you're here," he said, opening the door. I gave him the coffee and his eyes went wide. He stopped coming by after I closed up shop, so I could tell he was grateful to have one last cup. We walked into the dimly lit lobby, potent with the smell of new carpet and fresh paint. "Wait here while I go turn everything on," he said, clearly excited. I stood in the darkness for almost a minute before the lights came on with the quiet hum of electric life. The lobby was filled with media displays of the cavern's history. There were photos and stories of opening day with updates for each anniversary. As I waited for Graham to return, I studied the older photos behind the glass case nearest to me. Suddenly, the hairs on my neck stood straight. I swore I could feel someone watching me. It was only then that I noticed his gaze staring back from one particularly old photograph. In it, a familiar figure stood at the center of a group of visitors looking back at me. It was the old man from the family. It was as if he were somehow staring at me through the photo. His eyes locked on the lens of the camera, and in turn, on me. It was hard to discern his age in that old faded photo, but he looked very much the same as he did today. The only difference was that instead of his usual gray suit, he was wearing a park ranger uniform. "Ah, you've met Jerry," said Graham with a laugh. "Jerry?" I asked. "I mean, we don't actually know his name. But we all call him Jerry. He was one of the first rangers to work the park. Him and his colleagues were responsible for a lot of the early mapping of the cave system. This photo and a bunch of other stuff was found locked in an old utility closet. Didn't even know it existed, cause that particular cave was closed off. Check it out," he said. leading me over the illustrated map covering the entire wall. He pointed to a blank spot of the map. Found it right there, actually. I had brought my grandfather's old brochure, so I pulled it out to compare to the current map. The blank tunnel he was pointing to still existed on my grandfather's map. Yeah, they left out a few of the trickier spots on the new maps. They didn't want to entice explorers into places they may not get out of, he said. May not get out of, I asked. Yeah, steep inclines, drop-offs, or just plain tight squeezes. They left those spots off, and the map you see today is just the safest, what we call vanilla trails. I showed him the red circle at the end of a pathway that they decided to omit in the modern map. Any idea why that is circled, I asked. Looks like the gulch, or at least whatever is past it. What's past it? What is the gulch, I asked. Not much to tell. It's one of those steepest descents, and is almost impassable without gear or a ladder. Which is a shame, really. I hear it's the most beautiful place in the system. It's got very unique veined stalagmites. Like this, I said, pulling the crystalline rock from my pocket. You're showing me a federal offense. I hope you know that, he said with a chuckle. What I asked, not expecting that response. You are literally showing me plundered goods. Where'd you even get it? My grandfather's collection, I confessed. They were a little more willy-nilly with the rules back then. Everybody was taking tokens and souvenirs. Before the Tucker boy, they kind of let people just roam, he said, pointing at a photo of well-dressed folks climbing a dangerous rock formation. What happened to the Tucker boy, I asked. No clue. That was the problem. They looked for him for weeks. He was visiting with his wife and son and went missing ... well, right around the gulch, actually. Which is why it's not on the maps, he said with another educational chuckle. I thought you said he was a boy. 18, but he was married with a son. Times were different back then. Graham walked over to another glass case, away from the main display. They've talked about taking this down for the renovation. I mean, it is a little dark, he said, pointing at a display of old missing persons photos spanning the decades of the park's operations. I had no idea, I gasped. That's him right there. Mr. Tucker himself, he said, pointing at a class photo of a face I knew all too well. The teenage boy from the family stared back, younger and happier. I was transfixed, but Graham was already moving on. Listen, I got nothing on the docket today, so if you want, I can take you close to the gulch. I just got to get some lights, he said, already on his way to get the back room. As I waited for his return, I made my way to the elevators that would bring us down into the caverns. The gift shop was located just across from them, so it would be the first thing visitors would see when they resurfaced. Cheesy t-shirts, postcards, and other junk were crammed into the small space. The entire shop seemed to be designed to frame a bookshelf filled entirely with copies of a history book about the caverns. Curious, I opened the book and flipped through the first few pages. It was as if the old man were haunting me through time itself. Again, his blank stare caught my eyes immediately, looking out from a full-page photograph of a staff photo inside the largest chamber of the caverns. It was labeled as October 23rd, 1924, 1 year after opening day. Even in his friendly park ranger uniform, his presence was so chilling that I almost missed her. Holding the hand of the old man was the teenage girl. She looked very much the same, but thinner and more gaunt. My attention was suddenly stolen by the cluttered clank of Graham approaching with his gear. Did he have a daughter, I asked, pointing at the photo of the old man. Graham leaned over to give a half-involved glance. Like I said, we don't even know his real name, he said with a half-shrug. He then walked over and hit the button for the elevator. His excitement was doing nothing to soften my growing anxiety over the photographs. The ride down took longer than I remembered, and my ears popped from the pressure change as we descended deep underground. As soon as the elevator doors opened into the first chamber, Graham disappeared into the darkness. Wait here, he said, stepping out. I followed, but stopped right outside the elevator. The dim, emergency lights cast haunting shadows across the cavern walls. It was just enough light for Graham to navigate without his flashlight. I could hear nothing but his footsteps and the muffled silence of the stale cavern air. When he reached his destination, His footsteps ceased and the silence settled in. That's not the end of the story. If you have hooked up till here, then hit like button and comment down what do you think will happen next. Also, if you haven't subscribed yet, then do support me by subscribing so you may not miss any video in future.